So, hey guys, today we're going to be talking about some tryhard strategies and tactics that you can use to maybe improve, or perhaps you're already doing. Well, I guess I'll save the most toxic one for last. So, we'll start with uh, trigger reading. So, every single action that you take here has a different kind of timing and different trigger based on that timing. So, for example, if I have let's go with, I guess, Unizombie. Unizombie will have no triggers, so it's telling in the sense that since this doesn't have a quick effect or a trigger effect, well, we can glean information from Unizombie in a lot of aspects, just for example. So if I have Unizombie in hand, there is going to be no trigger for Unizombie, right? If Unizombie is on field, there will also be no trigger. So if my opponent does have a trigger, it does give us information, depending on the exact situation. Worth mentioning, I guess, is that in main phase 1, it's complete open game state, so our opponent has priority to do anything or nothing, in which case your opponent could sit around and do nothing for, like 5-6 minutes, not even setting a card and timing out. Very possible. So uh, you have the option to just go to the end phase, and that could be your only option, potentially. Maybe you can't even normal summon, special summon, activate a card, set a card. All of those could be illegal actions. Also worth mentioning is when you set a back row card, that card isn't necessarily activatable. There's also the aspect that that card doesn't even necessarily have to be a spell or trap. It can also be like Prime Mineral Congrate, I believe. I think you can set that, and also all of the artifact cards, like Artifact Lancia, for example, which explains why there might be potentially no trigger to a set card. But yeah, Unizombie specifically though has two effects that are pretty interesting. So we have essentially a discard effect and a effect to send a zombie monster from your deck to the graveyard. So the interesting thing about this is if I use effect 1 here to discard and there is no trigger, okay? That could mean a lot of things. So we'll assume I just discard, we'll go with a spell or trap. So if my opponent has no response to Chainlink 1 Unizombie effect to discard, that means a lot of cards, well, unless our opponent is hiding the triggers, then we can confirm a lot of cards that should be activatable at this point, but they have no trigger for it. So Infinite Impermanence, our opponent does not have this. Maxi, this is going to be activatable, so not this. Effect Failure, our opponent does not have this either. Lancia, this can be activated anytime as well, so they don't have that either. What they could have is something that could potentially be triggered rather than a quick effect that you can activate at any time. Like, potentially still, they could have Droll and Lockbird. They could also potentially have Ash Blossom Joyous Spring, which we could somewhat confirm whenever we activate Unizombie's effect to send a zombie monster from our deck to the graveyard, which is ashable. So if they have a trigger to the second thing, but not the first thing, we know they at least have Ash Blossom Joyous Spring. And we can identify that they don't have this, or any Mold Charmy probably. They do not have either. Gamma, they wouldn't have either. And this is off of just activating your own cards. You can kind of tell based on trigger your opponent has something or not. And that's just one way to go about it, right? And other ways to confirm this could just be activating something as simple as like a Rhoda. So, for example, if I go ahead, activate Rhoda, and then I will see that my opponent has no trigger. So, if they have no trigger, then we can do a normal summon of some sort of monster. So we'll go with Rosin. And then if my opponent has a trigger for Rosin and they're not using it, it's not going to be Ash Blossom Joe Spring because we already resolved Rhoda and there was no response for this, right? Or if there was a response, they didn't use it. So they could still have Ash Blossom, but they would just logically Ash Blossom like Rosin, which we're assuming they're not doing here, meaning they likely do not have Ash Blossom because this is one of the best Ash Blossom targets against Vanquish Soul. So do they potentially have infinite impermanence or effect failure then? If they have a trigger on this. They have a trigger on this. They could have it, but they might be hesitant to use it unless they have multiple imperm or veiler. Assuming your opponent is actually good at Yu-Gi-Oh! And not like kind of pressing buttons, right? Because the choke point for Vanquish Soul that you can guaranteed get an imperm off of would be, or yeah, you just hit Rock of the Vanquisher with imperm, and this is completely unavoidable. You cannot tag out Rock of the Vanquisher, right? So you just would hit the rock instead of Rosin with like your imperm. So could be holding for that. But if you had multiple, well, you could still hold for the next turn, but it's not as good because quick effect to search Yaolong, and then you would just be hitting the Link one again, which I don't think is that optimal, especially if you have effect failure. So it could be another imperm, and that's kind of the idea, right? You're able to glean a lot of information from your opponent having a trigger or not. And worth mentioning, I guess, is on release, the game actually ratted you out if you had Maxi. It was kind of funny, actually. So, well, it didn't have to be Maxi in particular, but there was actually like 2 other cards that had the same trigger timing as Maxi, I believe. So we gotta check real fast to see if this was one of them. Yeah. So we have Numeron Wall, Maxi, and the last one being Thunder Dragon Dark. These were the only 3 that would be played. No one was playing Lancia then because name a card that banishes specifically on your opponent's turn that matters. Yeah, pretty rough. Honestly, I guess Pride Brigade. I don't think this was useful against Eldlik because it's SF5 pass. But yeah. At the start of the duel, unless you are like really quick with it, or if you're loading in. Well, right now, as of currently, if you enter a duel, so let's assume I am turn player. My opponent, their field will glow red. And that will always happen now at the start of the duel as a process, as part of the process of loading in. But that didn't always happen at the start of Master Duel. So if your opponent's field did glow during the draw phase, that just means they have one of probably these 3 cards. So Thunder Dragon Dark, not that popular. So it meant one of 2 things. Your opponent is either A, on Numeron, or B, they have Max E. So in both cases, it means passing is actually a decent option. So first off, Numeron, they can't actually they cannot successfully OTK against a empty board a lot of the time unless they open the exact random card they need to like double the Numeron monsters. If they hard open it, they hard open it, I guess. And then aside from that, with Maxi. Maxi is just a completely dead card in hand if you were to just raw pass and do absolutely nothing. So that'd be like insane hard read. And I mean, it sometimes comes up with certain hands where ratting that information out is enough to win you that game in which you otherwise shouldn't have won, but you know your opponent has the Maxi here in this case. So, yeah. That's just a thing, I guess. And there's also like a bunch of different cards. Like for example, Bestials. If your opponent didn't have any responses until you had a light or dark monster in the graveyard, boom, Bestial. If your opponent didn't have any responses until you put a card in the graveyard, so for example, after my Rota resolves, my opponent has something, but I was like normal summoning and doing some monster-based combos with like Vanquish Soul, so you can generally tell, oh, my opponent had DD Crow here, for example. So that's like the general idea, I guess, of abusing triggers. But then if you want to be, well, I guess a giga tryhard, I guess just thinking about the trigger timing and what cards your opponent could possibly have for the triggers. Well, to go above and beyond this level, I guess would be to just completely hide all your triggers so your opponent can glean no information. And this is like one of the sweatiest tactics, and I don't really use this a lot myself, but so let's say, for example, my opponent is going to use, let's go with Foolish Burial. Foolish Burial, I think, is typically a fine card to allow it to resolve because there isn't a single Foolish Burial target that actually does anything impactful, in my opinion. So, for example, with Foolish Burial Goods or Foolish Burial, the typical idea is you're going to send something to the graveyard that's going to search something else, and that's when you make your play. Usually, you're sending something that's going to trigger something else, and that's how Foolish Burial works, right? So, in this case, I could hold Ash Blossom Geospring till after Foolish Burial resolves for information. So assuming my opponent does my opponent does Foolish Burial first, then I immediately Ash Blossom this. I will get no information on what my opponent's playing. And the card they wanted to trigger, it can trigger again. Well, it's not triggering again. It'd be triggering for the first time later whenever they send it for combo. So for example, let's assume the card in question they want to trigger will be Nerval. So they attempt to send Nerval to the graveyard, or maybe it's Kit. We can negate Kit/Nerval in the graveyard after it gets sent. Instead of, I guess, going negate Foolish Burial, we can wait till Nerval actually hits the graveyard because that's a more impactful Ash. That's a little bit off topic, I guess. But it kind of coincides a little bit, and this would not be that useful in this case. It's more useful in some cases, like maybe your opponent's playing Branded, and they see no response, and they might misplay, and they decide to, for Branded opening, they will pitch Called by the Grave. I mean, that's like a heinous, really bad misplay, but, you know, there's potential for stuff like that, I guess, technically. And then whenever they activate Brand Fusion, boom, you an Ash here. Or I guess you can hide the information that you have Bestials, and then Bestial before end of main, like Albion the Branded Dragon, perhaps. That is totally just doable, I guess. So, you know, if you have information on what your opponent has, then it gives you the opportunity to play around it. So for example, let's go with, let's assume 100% of the time in this situation, our opponent will have Max E. And for some reason, we just know they have Max E, okay? So my hand is going to consist of, let's go with Kashira Unicorn, and then we have Raids Off, okay? And the other cards we have, they just won't be important, okay? So we'll go, if we go ahead and activate Rates Off first, then our opponent will know we're on cash and that we're about to special summon some Kashtira monster. So the logical answer to play Ram XC as much as possible here is to special summon Unicorn immediately if our opponent does not shotgun the Maxi. And then let's assume we actually have maybe a third card, like we'll go with Macrocosmos, where if our opponent does hit us with the Maxi, we have the game plan of simply setting the macro and flipping it over in like draw phase next turn. And then this will play around the Maxi in a totally different way. So this could be a deck that's not even cash anymore. Like, we'll go with Vanquish Soul. Actually, this doesn't require a special summoning from hand. We'll go with... what was the name of this archetype? Regenesis? Yeah, so... Wait, these are inherent summons also. Okay, we'll go with Therion. But they don't really work well under macro, actually. But, you know, good enough, I guess. Actually, no, wait. Got it. Runic. But actually, instead of macro, it would be Fissure then. So that'd be the general idea, I guess. If we chain any of these to add Fountain, then there's the idea of our opponent maxing us, and maybe we're playing like Sprite Runic or something. That doesn't really matter. But yeah. That's just how abusable knowing information is, I suppose, right? And, you know, who knows how bad our opponent's hand could be? They could even be doubling up on Maxi. So activating a Fissure and then passing could be fairly valid if you have some hand traps, for example. But then next we have the idea of if your opponent has certain hand traps, you might play around things differently. Like if your opponent has Nibiru, then, you know, you can do some funky things to play around Nibiru a little bit if your opponent is blatantly showing that they have Nibiru. So, for example, if I'm playing Blackwing, you actually have no real good ways to play into Nib. So your actual play is to just wait, basically. So Blackwing the Soul Dragon can be special summoned by banishing from your graveyard Blackwing Dragon and Borea Storm the Wicked Wind, and you can usually pass on having Twin Shadow to bring back a guy later as well. So if we just go ahead and wait for our opponent, like, to use the Nibiru pretty much, so we're going to just have these two in the graveyard, maybe potentially more, and then just try to go end phase. And if our opponent doesn't drop the Nib, we keep whatever board we have set up. If they do, then we can recover a little bit by passing on Blackwing the Soul Dragon, at least one of them, and then potentially activating Twin Shadow to... Well, yeah, this is pretty hard to stop, but yeah, we can summon like a full armor master, grab something, you know? That just kind of works. And yeah, that'd be the general idea, I guess, of one reason you might want to hide the triggers, but it's fairly hard to do. So if you mess up, you could just, for example, if you mess up with your chain timings, you could miss like a branded fusion where you were supposed to ash this, but you would chain off. So yeah, I mean, it's just a way to improve at the game, I guess. And then now, time for the last and most toxic try hard sweaty strategy that I have. So this one is honestly unethical, and you know, I gotta say I'm guilty of doing this sometimes, and sometimes it's unintentional because I need to use my cards in a certain way for them to be effective. But we'll go with this example, I guess. So let's assume that we'll go with Blackwing Twin Shadow. So it could be a lot of different cards. Essentially, it's just any card that has a trigger. So all you gotta do is turn your chain to on. So every single action your opponent takes, you will have chain on. So now you're essentially doing what I like to call here as time burn, you know? So time burn, pretty damn toxic, right? So with time burn, the basic idea here is that we're going to just, every single chance we have for the game to pass priority to us, we're going to take the priority. And so because we're taking the priority, this is essentially burning down our opponent's available time. So time burn, basically, right? So for example, if I had Twin Shadow or Tearlament Kashtira, just it could be effect failure, Abyssal, whatever. Just something that I can activate. I will take every single opportunity for the priority to pass to me, and then I'll immediately right click, and that will pass the priority back to my opponent. So every single time you take an action, it'll pass to me and then pass back to you. And this will basically, it's not like insanely notable or noticeable, but essentially what's going on here is we're going to abuse the fact that perhaps we have a bad connection to each other. Perhaps my opponent's inability to play fast. And every time it passes back to me and then back to you, there's actually a delay, a small delay, where you can't actually make any actions until the priority has fully passed back to you. And during that time where the game kind of has to resync a little bit, you're losing precious seconds. So let's just go through, let's go with a Malice line real quick, you know? So first action, normal summon Dormouse, priority pass, pass back. That's 1 second. Activate Dormouse effect, and then resolve. That's going to burn an additional 2 seconds off of that effect, actually. So yeah, we pass back. All right, so you're activating Dormouse, and then you have to activate the next effect, and that passes back priority again, and then you have to special summon that card. So they'll burn like 5 seconds already, and that's off of just essentially just normal summon Dormouse effect, and then you have like White Rabbit, special summon White Rabbit, and then on special summon of White Rabbit, pass back priority. Well, actually, no, wait. There's a trigger on this, so it doesn't work exactly like that. So trigger White Rabbit, pass priority to me, pass priority back, resolve White Rabbit, set your card, and then before you can activate, well, actually, this counts as a quick effect. So if you don't want to use the effect immediately, you'll have to pass back priority to me. So on resolution of White Rabbit effect, pass priority back, and then I pass priority back to you. So as you can see, that this is essentially just resolve 2 effects, and I've already done this crap like 7 times or something dumb, right? So by the time you actually full on finish your combo, this will burn like a minute or 2 off your clock, or potentially even 3, depending on how complicated the game state is. So if you also need time to think before taking your actions, and then time to perform your actions, you can see how this is really just toxic and just kind of unsportsmanlike to do, but it is technically a win con you can go for, right? So I don't think this is really punishable or anything you could do about this, and you could make a legitimate argument that, you know, I was just waiting for the exact right time to activate my Tearlament's Kashtira or my Blackwing Twin Shadow. So with Twin Shadow in particular, the reason you want to keep chain on for this, like, you might not even intentionally be like time burning your opponent, but you do need to keep chain on and to pass back priority every single like toggle with Twin Shadow, because you don't want to activate Twin Shadow at the moment. So at the point our opponent has special summoned that Malice monster, we might not even want to activate this. And that is because in this case, our target that we're thinking of is going to likely be Blackwing Silverwind the Ascendant. So Ascendant has the fact of when this card is synchro summoned, you can target up to 2 face-up monsters on the field. With defense lower than this card's attack, destroy those targets. You cannot conduct your battle phase the turn you activate this effect. So the first word is what's really important here, when. So if we were to ever Chainlink 2, our Twin Shadow to summon Silverwind, this will miss timing and not be able to pop. And also this applies to some ninja cards, I believe, where you can miss timing with those as well, with I believe it's Hanzo. So you have to be careful with that as well. But yeah. So with Silverwind, we have to use Twin Shadow as Chainlink 1, otherwise it will miss timing. So yeah, that's a reason to have Chain on, is you need to be Chainlink 1, and you cannot achieve Chainlink 1 on your opponent's turn if you have your chain set to auto for the most part. There are like some timings where it might work out, but for the most part, you'll want to Silverwind to actually resolve at certain timings, which is not possible with auto chain. So yeah, that's kind of how that works, I guess. And there are precise timings for when you want to use certain interactions. Like for example, I want Book of Moon, Dormouse on normal summon, and not in chain to Dormouse effect, for example. And you know, maybe because of my exact board state, Twin Shadow just doesn't come up, but I have chain on for this. And an even older example, if you wanted it, I guess, would be like Restore Halki Fibrax, and this wouldn't be going on for necessarily the whole duel, but yeah, Restore Halki Fibrax does not like miss timing. But Formula Synchron misses timing actually when this card is synchro summoned, and Hulk's effective special summon here counts as a synchro summon. So you can just miss a draw on Formula Synchron if you don't have like chain on. And then we have Formula Synchron, which we might want chain on for and not chain auto. And same thing with like an IP Masquerena, because we want to make sure perhaps we use this before our opponent enters battle phase. And that's like a valid reason to have chain on, right? And because our opponent might take a long time in the main phase and we have no reason to use Formula Synchron's effect yet, or in this case, maybe it could be an IP, then this will just have the consequence of kind of time burning our opponent a little bit, which I'm going to call this like natural time burn, where it just happens because of the cards you happen to be playing, I guess, right? Versus intentional time burn, where I have a worthless card that doesn't do anything, like perhaps a Bestial, and the only targets I have to banish are my own cards, and it's not a particularly useful Bestial in the situation. So we'll say like we have maybe a Sereneer, but all we can do with the Sereneer is banish our effect failure. And I purposely have our my chain timing to on, so every single action being taken, we're going to just continuously kind of like trigger our Mistral and then passing priority back and forth and wasting our opponent's timer, or lowering our opponent's timer in, I guess, a relatively toxic way. And you know, because honestly, it could be a skill issue if my opponent's just not playing fast. I'm not like 100% against this. It's just not really ethical or moral or very sportsmanlike. But yeah, it's not like something that's impossible to deal with by any means, right? A win's a win, I guess, is what I'm saying, right? And I think the strategy is like fairly valid. So, for example, if my opponent was on Dark World and I have a Bestial, I might do this because it's a valid win con. We're going for time because Dark World combos take a long ass time. So I might do this nonsense with a Bestial, right? I think that's fairly valid still. But if your opponent does play quick enough and efficiently enough, they can actually still win despite me trying to time burn them through all of their actions that they're taking. And time burn isn't completely free. It's fairly free because it's not going through your own timer that much. But yeah, I guess it is still somewhat burning your timer. And assuming you're time burning your opponent's first turn, and it's going to be a long turn, and you already know this, this will somewhat burn through your timer, and then your opponent can actually time burn you back, I suppose. Considering that they will definitely have an end board of some sort after the ordeal that was turn one, they'll be able to then kind of time burn you back, and you do not get time back for the second turn. Assuming you were going second, you don't get time back. You only start getting time back every turn afterwards, and when you like end turn, I guess. So I believe it's like, what was it, like you getting 30 seconds when you're passing to your opponent's turn, and then you gain like 60 seconds when it becomes your turn again. It was something like that. So yeah, might be toxic, but you know, if it's an option and we're being sweaty about it, then I guess that this tactic is worth mentioning. And, you know, as with every single strategy here, you don't have to use everything I've talked about here. You might just want to use what you want to use or what's applicable to you, you know? Because maybe you're not going to be good at certain strategies. Maybe you don't think they're moral. Well, whatever. Maybe they're difficult to pull off. So, yeah, that's all I got for you guys today, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye.